minute, Wonder Woman.
I mean to tell you, this is the artist who is worth it. Actually, that's where I was going to start. I do believe, even with all this, should we say, slow start, we'll be looking at more Courbet all of today. And it's because his work, especially from the 1850s, sort of brings to the fore ideas that were bubbling up in art and art and society at that time, and that are so much a basis in our, well, just what we think of as modern in art. And as I said, that sometimes people say the avant-garde begins with him. So in the beginning, there's some fairly difficult and philosophical work, and then at the end, we'll look at some fairly pornographic work as a compensation for that. Because his career traverses it all. So in going back first to the Stonebreakers, I'll just remake a point that I made multiple times, I believe by now, about what kind of a provocation or confrontation this would be for traditional, average, art-loving person. And it'll be even more so true with this. Oh my goodness, let's get this. And we're going to take as the one that people would be familiar with, that was in accord with what they had been trained to think was art and what art was for, was this Bouguereau that I'd flashed on at another time. Now, it doesn't sync in terms of date with what Courbet is doing, but in terms of subject matter, Bouguereau's style didn't really change throughout his long career. But this, one of the washerwomen, this is so it presents peasants and labor. And if you stop to think of the labor, it is very difficult labor. These women bending over in the stream, having to beat the clothes against a rock. And anybody who deals with wet cloth knows that carrying a bundle of wet clothing on your head, you have to carry it on your head because it is extraordinarily heavy. And this woman, she has to be pretty strong if she's going to heave and get that up on her head. So the realities of this are utterly glossed over, or just look how confidently she steps forward on a bare foot and in her impeccably clean clothes, this turned up almost like taffeta with the light on it. The composure in her face, the perfect features. You know what that goes back to? In the academic tradition, it's really, this is the closest I could come with it. Say that Caryatids on the porch of the Erechtheum in Athens, and here these maidens whose arms were down, who carried the ceiling of that porch on their heads. This absolute composure of these feminized columns. Bouguereau was explicit about this, and this he would have, and here he's a spokesman for that whole academic tradition. They were presenting what is, in their lights, real and true. And that didn't mean what's incidental in life, not just the way you look when you look in the mirror or your environment looks at, but the underlying reality, the sort of the God-given perfection. It is essentially a kind of a deeply spiritual attitude. and that it was the obligation of the artist to bring out that finer reality behind the visible reality. Well, that is one reason. It would have always been the art approved by authorities. And the whole French Academy, goes back in its founding to the time of Louis XIV, when he needed artists who would appropriately decorate the palace at Versailles and publish images of him. So it's always been tied with a kind of authority. And so you shouldn't think about the blemishes in the authority, but just the divine right to rule, and a kind of a message of hope beyond the incidentals of ordinary life. And Courbet, not a Christian, no, what is worth looking at is the world you see right in front of you. That is the reality. Nothing beyond it, but it in itself. And the reality in this fraught time in the middle of the 19th century, when there are such great social upheavals and where people are moving to the cities and industry is rising and the peasantry is being more and more debased and impoverished, we ought to see those people, to know that they are people, that they are of equal importance to ourselves. And so he presents these men. And although, therefore, the salon and the judges of the salon are appalled by this, there were people, and thank you, Carolyn, for that question last week about, well, how does work get in? I mean, why did anybody look at this? Those ideas were stirring, especially not so much in the visual arts, but in literature and in social philosophy. As they say, this is the time of the development of the Communist Manifesto. And there was just an upswell against tradition everywhere. So there was a rise of people who believe the government should be a Republican government, a Democratic government, not in our sense, a socialist government. There was something that there should be sort of a communal life where people were affiliated by what they did. And there's so many experimental ways of living that were being contemplated. So the radical social thinkers would look at this and see Courbet as essentially as being one of them. And he was a very good friend of several of those thinkers. And then this is actually, you're going to be so sick of this painting by Couture of the Romans of Decadence from just before 1850, this big machine of a painting that was very much approved in the Salon. I'm going to go to something a little more subtle that this painting, I'm just picking out because I'm beating you over the head with it from time to time. There's something being presented here, even in terms of the composition. Not only despite the disorder of so many people in such states of disorder, but this is such an orderly composition, closed on this side, closed on this side, this figure balanced against this figure back here, a central focus balanced by these other figures here, the reclining woman, the brightest light right at the center of the picture. And so there's order, a rational order, which is not too difficult to discern. And not only is there order, but there's a centralized focus. This statue, her, the equal balance of the composition on either side. That is a very pervasive, implicit message to belief in a unifying central source of authority, whether it's in the center of the picture or not. But the imagery certainly leads you to look in an image like, where's the focus here? What is the power? What is it we're supposed to be looking at? Where's the generating part of this picture? I say all that because there were political thinkers who really liked the burial at Ornans from 1850 because they saw this as a political statement, not just because of these are peasantry, because here, peasantry, they don't look particularly poor and they're not being downtrodden with hard labor here. It is that you are having to look at them as life size and therefore as important as you, as important as the Greek god, as important all those people at that Roman feast. But what they saw, there is nobody here more important than anybody else. This is just an additive, as a procession would be. One figure, another figure, another figure. It doesn't even focus on grief for the dead. You can hardly see at first glance over here where the casket is being brought in. And even the grave is brought just to the very bottom of the picture and made very small since it moves out toward us instead of across the space. So, and the cross is off to the side. This dog reminds you, oh, there might be something interesting to look over here. This kid looks off into space. This one looks over here. There's the gravedigger turns toward the priest, who's not at the center, doesn't stand up over above everybody else. That'd be as bright color as the beetle here. The political thinker said, this represents his espousal of democracy, where each person is important as every other person. Now, Courbet didn't say that he was, he didn't exactly abandon that, but he said, no, I'm just showing you what I see. But so you see, his art is already being put to use by a public that always thinks art has a message, a story, something we're to learn from. Now, that's much easier to deal with in representational art than in contemporary art. But so that this is an important message. It's not just an illustration of something I saw, but that there is something meaningful in this. That is traditional. It's just that they're saying that the message is not traditional, saying just sort of like democratic sense. Now, I suppose we'd have to think about what we see on social media, where discussions like that would be played out. And to go back to the one that's in the mat of the young ladies of the village who were his sisters, and this is just a year later from the burial at Ornans. So these are right around 1850. There's something I didn't mention last time because I didn't know it last time. Originally, this painting was bought by the very wealthy, illegitimate half-brother of the ruler of France. So already it's being seized upon by a person of wealth, and Courbet is making money in this painting that otherwise to the general public was just so appalling, that these forms are so out of scale, not centralized originally, evidently, and the underlying sketch, the cows are even smaller, and you made the cows bigger, so they even less fit into this. It's really disjunctive. But see, as opposed to, again, one where this is so fluent, so lovely, so much still focusing on human beings, the landscape is their background. However impoverished they are, the poverty is subdued. And these girls, now another thing that people were agitated in Paris, the Parisians, about this, is the color of their skin. They're dirty. And that's because of Courbet's way of painting, which I had shown you once just in a close-up from I believe it was from the burial, because he painted in a quite traditional way with a dark undercoat of paint, and then he slathered on the paint over that. But the undercoat had it's like a tar in it, and it's gotten darker over time. But so there's like a kind of a blackish under layer. And so in the shadows, sometimes where he didn't bother to paint, that blackish underlayer comes through. So his method of painting is making the colors of their flesh change in ways that people could not accept. Now, for Courbet, there was a possibility that this and the Stonebreakers, which they're about the same scale, he was thinking of them as sort of like companion pieces. The one showed the life of the peasants as extremely arduous, and they're very impoverished. And then here you have a peasant being given alms by his sisters in a job that was, well, is boring. It's just herding the cattle, but there's no physical labor in it. So this might have been the pleasanter side of peasant life that he's exploring in it. Oh dear, again, it's not one thing another here. And we talked about this last time as his, again, painting only what he sees. With this preparation of the dead girl who has, for the sake of the sale of the painting, at some subsequent period was turned into the preparation of a bride. And the one that I flashed onto at the very end last time. And I'll have a cartoon about this one as well. You can imagine this possibly didn't go over very well. It's the Bathers from 1854, and it's more than 7 feet high. So it's fairly large. Originally, this woman did not have the white drape that was added later on. But it's like, good grief. On many grounds, the figure is such a thoroughly unidealized woman. And what's going on? What is this affected gesture of, this must be her servant, who's sort of provocatively pulled down one stocking and the other one's already off. But what's her gesture? What sense does that make? None. What gesture does this make? What sense is that? And what's she doing? Is she easing backward into the water? And is it chilly and that's why her arm goes up? What's the story? She has taken off her clothes and wrapped them over a tree here. You can see Courbet's signature. Now, Courbet, who did say he looked at and then rejected the whole history of art, in this case, I think is quite possibly alluding to the history of art in the way that his younger friend Monet will be doing, and we will be seeing Monet before this series is over, because this is a Rubens of the Three Graces, and you see how in the top of the painting, these three pulchritudinous females have disrobed and tossed their garments up over the branch, as this would be here. But those are Rubens' concept of ideal female beauty, a Flemish 17th century sense, not a 19th century sense. there's a possibility, very strong likelihood, that there was another source, and that was contemporary photography. And quite possibly this same, the model that you see right here, who was quite a familiar model, but when you can't see her face, it's not clear. Now, this is a photograph made by a man who started out studying to be a painter and was not succeeding in that. So he was very clever and entrepreneurial. He then became a lithographer, and then he became a photographer, and he photographed things like costumes and historical settings and nudes. Now, the nudes were not for pornography. There were a lot of pornographic photographs coming in at this time, but these were, he had a license from the state to produce these because they were just little tiny, maybe 3-inch high paper photographs, which he sold to painters and sculptors who could not afford to have always a live model when they worked, and when they weren't going to the Académie Suisse or one of the academies where they could look at a live model, they could use these photographs as their source. So it's pretty likely that Courbet is drawing both on the tradition of art and on contemporary photography when he presents this woman. And my, did this one get made fun of. It was exhibited in a salon, and this is what someone did as a takeoff on it. She's got these vast bloomers. And here the maid is just, has her sock, looks like she's going to get ready, crouching over, ready to put it on. Courbet was beginning to be called master of the school of ugly. Courbet's response to all this kind of uproar that he would cause was a statement. He says, when I'm no longer controversial, I'll no longer be important. So he courted this. Here's a portrait he did of a man who was extremely important to him, a man named Alfred Bruyas, Bruyas. Important for his role, rather, I suppose, than anything else. This portrait that Courbet made of him is in mid-1840s. Bruyas came from southern France. He was very wealthy. He's a son of a well-to-do banker. He wanted to be an artist. He went to art school. He wasn't any good. So he became a patron of the arts. And he was one of those patrons who was very interested in art as introducing social reform, as reaching people, presenting a model of what life ought to be. And he became fast friends with Courbet, supported Courbet's ideas. So, how much as Courbet wanted to be controversial, to work in isolation is not conducive to productivity. So Bruyas gave him several commissions, helped him free him from his father's support, helped his already substantial sized ego, and helped him establish himself. Bruyas was a man who had sufficient ego as well. He commissioned all sorts of artists. I mean, Corot, Couture, the Romans of decadence man, Cabanel, Rousseau. His taste was really Catholic across a whole range of artists. And what he commissioned for many of them was portraits of himself. Something like 40 portraits of Bruyas he commissioned within 20 years. I'll just give you a couple of others by other artists. Here's one by Cabanel, who worked in the academic style, very precise, no brushwork visible, meticulous detail, cool reserve. Or a slightly homier version by an artist who's on the, well, he's a good portraitist. So here's Brouillard, is rather more the aesthete with some of his collections of paintings behind him. And this is the painting that Courbet did with Brouillard and his servant. That is the one that makes it into all the books, because its title is The Meeting, or just greetings, sir. Because here you have Brouillard actually taking his hat off, doffing his hat in front of Courbet with his painting equipment on his back, as if he's going to go do some painting out of doors. In his profile, Courbet called this his Assyrian profile, because there are Assyrian portraits of men with long, elaborate beards like that. And this painting was derided as well, because, like, what kind of puffed up self-presentation is this, that the patron is humbly greeting the artist? Because artists have always been, subject to the patron's whims, and not in this one. This actually there was a woodcut that this is based on it, and it's a folk art woodcut. And he puts himself in the position of the person in the woodcut as the wandering Jew, the outsider who can see into the future. And Brouillard had that view of Courbet, that he was bringing about a future. Now, this is another part of this more complex philosophical thinking behind it all, especially by a social thinker. Said, change is going to come. Of course, not through the family of Napoleon. Change is going to come from three classes in society: from industrialists, from scientists, and from artists. And so Courbet then is spearheading the artists. And of course, this was mocked as well. In this one, the mocking is that this is like I guess I don't have that, which shows this. But it's like the approach of Christ on the road. Yeah, this is a very complex painting that we look at next, and maybe is the one that has provoked the most writing and the most thought and the most confusion. The simple title is just the artist's studio, or the studio of the painter, and it dates from 1855. And you see, it's another one of those enormous paintings. Just before this, Courbet had been approached by the man who was in charge of the whole Academy of Fine Arts, who wanted to commission a painting from Courbet. So Courbet's career is on the ascendant, despite the politically provocative parts. But the chancellor, head of the department of the Academy of Fine Arts, wanted to commission Courbet to do something that would be sort of temper that political aspect of his work. And Courbet, of course, would not. This is what Courbet reported he said to that man. This is what he said to his friends. I added that I was the only judge of my painting, that I was not only a painter, but a man, and that I had been painting not in order to make art for art's sake, but to accomplish my intellectual freedom, and that I had succeeded through the study of tradition of freeing myself from that I alone of all my contemporaries among French artists have the ability to express and translate in an original manner both my personality and the social environment. In other words, no, I will not do it. the commission was had something in mind, because in 1855 there was going to be one of those World's Fair in Paris, and so it was to have some paintings by Courbet to be put in the halls of French art there. So Courbet produced this, and it was rejected. Now, it's not the Salon, so it didn't have an automatic acceptance anyway, but it seems that it was probably rejected because it was just too big. And there were a lot of other Courbet paintings that were in that World's Fair. Well, what happened instead? By the way, Courbet painted this in only 6 weeks. We'll look at a lot of it, but so that's the building for that World's Fair, the 1855 World's Fair. And very nearby on the Champs-Élysées, Courbet, with the financial support of Bruyas, built his own pavilion. See, Exposition Courbet. To display that painting and 40 others of his paintings. And there was even a checklist and an essay by Courbet in it, and you had to pay to get in. Originally, Courbet's idea is just to have like a tent outside, and then his ambitions swelled, partly because the burial at Ornans had been sent to Germany. I think it was to Frankfurt for an exhibition, where it was very popular, and people paid a lot of money to get in to see it. Well, it's often true in French art that it's more popular outside France before it gains popularity in France. And that was the case. So Courbet thought he could pull that off at home as well. Now, this is such an important moment, not simply because this is such an audacious thing to do, but this is going to be something that then also catches the attention of other artists. It's a new way they can get the works out. They don't have to depend on the salon. They don't have to depend on a dealer picking up their art and selling it. Sells them assiduously, or maybe not, doesn't sell them very much at all. But you can arrange your own exhibition. Monet will do this, and then in the 20th century, it's subsequently been fairly, well, it's not common, but it happens. So this is another step toward the modern view of the artist as a leader, as an independent artist, working for himself, and then leading the way. So this painting, now I have to read from my paper what the title is, because this, it's too much for me. It's the shorthand title to call it the Artist Studio, or the Studio of the Painter. Here's the official title. And it is, by the way, about 12 feet high by 18 feet long. The Studio of a Painter, a real allegory determining 7 years of my life as an artist. Well, that title right away is like flummoxing people. How can you have something that's an allegory and say that it's real at the same time? And what is he doing? An allegory of my life as a painter. Well, see, now there is something that's a central focus, just as in the Romance of Decadence. And what is the central focus? It's Courbet. So it's figuring out just what all is in this. Now, he published a pamphlet about his art, and he wrote some about this, but more than that, he also wrote to his friends, well, let people try to figure this out. It'll keep them busy. Because here's one thing he said about it that I think is just as head-scratching as all the rest. It's the whole world coming to me to be painted. On the right, all the shareholders, by which I mean friends, fellow workers, and lovers. And on the left, is the other world of everyday life, the masses, wretchedness, poverty, wealth, the exploited and the exploiters, people who make a living from death. I believe now almost every one of these figures have been identified. And this couple, maybe their identity is a little tentative, and this couple of lovers, they're not known, but the rest, these are largely portraits. And to do this in 6 weeks, part of what Courbet did was to gather up a lot of portraits he'd done of people, and then he repeats them in there. So what's going on here? Well, it has to be some allegory. This cannot be very real, because if he's painting a landscape, it's in a setting which is all figural. So here's Courbet with his Assyrian beard, and he's leaning back, looking at, he's painting a landscape. Delacroix said this is, the thing that looks most real in this whole painting is that landscape. And behind him is a woman who's disrobed and then has this drape here. Now, she could possibly represent academic art, looking over his shoulder, that he's turning his back on the academic tradition. That's speculation. It's being looked with great awe and admiration by this youngster. That's the innocence of youth who realizes the worth of what he's doing? Possibly. And who are the people over here? Well, here's a Jew with a money box. There's a red-faced, corpulent priest. I told you he didn't believe in established religion. Here's an old guy who would have been a fighter for Napoleon. I think these are all identified as revolutionaries, a Romanian revolutionary, a Russian revolutionary, and I don't know the other place, from the revolutions of 1848, that there was their portraits as well. Here's a merchant selling cloth. This hunter, that's a somewhat disguised, not very disguised portrait of Napoleon III, who loved to hunt. The discarded hat and fiddle down here. Those are props for old-fashioned romantic painting. There's another artist prop of a skull there. This would be sort of like an old-fashioned religious painting. A rich merchant. There's an impoverished woman who's nursing her baby here. So it's all different classes of society, all different occupations, all different ages, all different countries. And interestingly, when you look, sort of move back and look at the painting overall, these figures are all smaller than the ones on this side. See that discontinuity? This is the stuff that is fed into his life, into the man he is now. And these are the people who support him as he is now and what he will be. There's Bruyas. Here's his old friend, the violinist, whose portrait is also in the mat. And I'll show you the social philosopher here. This is a great friend and art critic of his. This is Baudelaire, a great critic, a great proponent of realism. And these are probably very wealthy patrons of his. So let's look at some details with better color. Are they on that ground? No. No more than when he does landscapes with other people really in the setting. So this is a mental construct. And that poor peasant boy with his unfeigned imagination and admiration. We'll see many more examples where this is better, but this is such a close detail. Possibly you would just use this for Courbet's way of painting. First, you can see there how he's left that undercoat visible, just the slashes, the light flesh color doesn't bother to meet the hairline. He would use a palette knife and sometimes rags to apply the paint. So he's definitely here too abandoning the academic tradition of that sort of traditional fine, small brushes. These are fairly coarse brushes, and he's staying way back rather than looking at them getting close to do great detail. I think you might recognize Bruyas right there. And we'll look at some of these other people. Go show you a photograph of this fellow and this fellow and another painting of that one. That's a photograph of Proudhon, the social philosopher who backed him. Sometimes essentially told Courbet he should talk less and paint more because he was too confusing in what he said. And then the art critic, Champfleury, who is another very great backer. And that's a portrait Courbet did of him. And the wealthy couple. Now, here the thing, I hope you can get a sense from this in just looking at her wonderful shawl, the way this simply stands out, as if you could see the metallic, I don't know if it's embroidery or painting surface of that, that it has like such a physical reality, as if you could just touch it. That tangible, the way Courbet with paint is some way able to suggest a physical world that just sort of like comes out and gets you. It's a really remarkable feature, and something that's influenced, say, non-representational 20th century artists. And then this is his friend Baudelaire, the novelist, the friend of Monet, an encourager of the ideas of Impressionism with his manuscript. And it's based on a portrait. See, Courbet was pulling all these together. So he was copying from them rather than having Baudelaire come in that rush of that 6 weeks to get the painting done. And this one, you see, Courbet is shown painting both with his beard, and essentially this is a painter's brush, and making fun of all the rest of it. Courbet, in all the glory of his own individuality, his real allegory, he shows that he's victorious in one thing, and one thing that he's not, and that's perspective. This is Daumier's caricature of critics at this time, looking at a Courbet. So by name, he is now famous enough that he's mentioned in these cartoons. Let me look at some works from the 60s. Oh, goodness. I do have to get you to the pornographic images today. And this is on the verge of that. It's called The Young Ladies on the Bank of the Seine. This is 1856. It's about 5.5 feet across. He's still showing real life. This real life is agitating to people because these young ladies in the new world of suburban pleasures for city people, taking the train out and going along the Seine and just relaxing along the banks of the river. The theme, which begins with this, but is then the theme, of course, of so much Impressionist art. What is so upsetting about this is that these women are very clearly courtesans, not just street workers, but sort of like higher paid call girls. And this one, in fact, has taken off her dress. These are her petticoats, and she's resting on them. So it's showing a reality of life. It was perfectly known that many, many men had mistresses and that this was a class of life in Paris, but it's not ordinarily have been shown in art. And it's a little bit more voluptuous, not just in them and that kind of indolence and pleasure there, but in the color, the still life. It's a good life being shown here. And she, heavy-lidded, is looking right out at us. This is the sketch he did for her from a live model. He really does have a genius for getting the life within life. This is a little bit later, another Domia Cartensis. Don't be such a bourgeois. At least, look at this Courbet. This would be that works in the 60s. Such as this one, it's in the Met. I tell you, the Met has a wonderful collection of Courbets. And if you look at the sources, they're often from the Havemeyer collection. That's the wife of Havemeyer, who was the sugar merchant baron. She was a good friend of Mary Cassatt, and it is Mary Cassatt who encouraged the Havemeyers to buy these Courbets. So she plays a very important role in getting these paintings to this country. So this one, Woman with a Parrot, 1866. I imagine a lot of you have seen it. It's more than 6 feet long. Courbet loved women. He was also, seems, had a rather complicated relationship with them. And this is probably, we know that women with long auburn hair in particular. So this is a woman for men to enjoy. In her pose there with the bird. So it's quite a sexual image. And there are postcards and sculptures of figures like this. This is the first one of his nudes that made it into the salon. He'd done another one, but it was figured to be too indecent, so that they were able to reject that. But it's such a joy in that hair, in that flesh, in the curves of her body, in the ampleness of her form. As opposed to 3 years before, Manet had done this, the Olympia, where she looks out at us, and that's what was so shocking. And that is that she she claims respect as in this confrontational gaze, she's as important as we are. And this is, in that sense, is really traditional. This is art for men. This is about Cabanel. So this man from the academic school, this is, the man owns a copy of this. I think there's several copies of it were made. The original was in 1863, so just a few years before this. And of course, Courbet is bringing into reality something like the Cabanel Venus on the waves, who's slightly also looking out at us. But that's all right, she was a Venus, you know. This is the most implausible water, right? It's like she's right there on a bed with this painted over it. And this. Now this he did for a private patron. And I want to mention this because of the private patron. Oh, it's a funny place to be stopping here, right? He was the Ottoman ambassador, so the Turkish ambassador in Paris, and he had a well-known collection of erotic art, and he commissioned Courbet to do this of these lesbian lovers. And certainly for this client in particular, he would put things like the glassware and the bouquet here, these touches of luxury. Toulouse-Lautrec will do lesbian lovers as well, because this is another part of the acknowledgement of the aspect of real life that in the brothels, it was often encouraged that the women had affairs with one another. I probably shouldn't leave that on for the last image, should I? Which is quite different from the nude bather that we started with. I'll leave this on, and we'll have a few of portraits by him and landscapes and other landscapes next time. But I want to finish with one more thing about the range of Courbet's subject matter. There's a fine Courbet scholar who has said that she interprets what he does as that he considered anything that could be a topic in a newspaper was an appropriate topic for a work of art. So any part of life that you could read about, you also ought to be able to see. And that motivated a lot of the choices. There are things like firemen rushing to a fire. He does many other subjects that we're not seeing here. We'll stop with this woman who happens to be the lover of James McNeill Whistler, and possibly also Courbet's lover. So do that in a couple of portraits next time. And as I say, landscapes. So does anybody have any questions? Anything you want to go back and look at?
Maggie?
Yes.
Could you go back to the one with the woman pointing in one direction and her maid holding up her hands the other way?
Yes.
Maybe I'm interpreting that wrong, but it seems to me that the woman, the mistress, is saying, come this way, and maybe to the water, and the maid is saying, no, no.
I don't know. I have no idea.
That's
Yeah, because there's some kind of interaction going on between them.
right.
She says, I'll take off one stocking, but I won't take off the other. And look how dirty her foot, the sole of her foot is. Any others?
Just a comment, Maggie.
Yeah.
Was he liked by other painters? He's such an egotistical so-and-so.
Yeah. I mean, he was such a, like Whistler. He worked with a lot of the younger artists. They learned from him. But then Courbet said that Whistler was his pupil. And Whistler never thought he was his pupil. He thought he was just somebody he knew. So I don't know about his having friendships much among artists, but his friendships were more among the intellectuals, these writers and philosophers. He probably didn't have room in his ego for another artist.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Maggie,
Yes.
they didn't have any Playboy back then, so this was their Playboy.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, they're from with the development of photography, there was a great growth of dirty postcards with photographs on them. And the photographers were licensed by the French government. So the government was making money off them. So that all was there, yeah. And so for Courbet, if it can be in a postcard, why can't it be in a painting? It's part of life. So life is.
I'm sorry. So where would they have been putting these paintings? I mean, if they had wives.
I don't know. I do know that it was fairly accepted for some wealthy industrialists that they would have mistresses and wives. But where they showed these pictures, I don't know. I think this one went down to Bruyas's museum in Montpellier, but I don't know. Anybody else? All right. Well, I hope I'll see you closer to the real time next week. Goodbye.